The priest's hands trembled as he held the poisoned chalice, knowing that in the next few moments he would have to choose between his God and his emperor. The young woman kneeling before him was barely 18, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she whispered prayers in a language that could get them both killed. It was February 7th, 203 CE, and in the amphitheater of Carthage, 20,000 Romans were screaming for blood. They wanted to watch this girl die. They wanted to see her torn apart by wild beasts, not because she had murdered or stolen or betrayed the empire, but because she refused to deny a carpenter from Nazareth who had been dead for over a century. Her name was Vibia Perpetua, and she was about to become one of the most documented martyrs in Christian history. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. This wasn't just a story about faith. This was a story about a young mother who was forced to choose between her baby and her beliefs, between her family and her conscience, between survival and something she believed was bigger than herself. And the choice she made would echo through 20 centuries, shaping the very foundation of Christianity itself. But it would come at a price that no 18-year-old should ever have to pay. Picture this: Carthage, North Africa, 203 CE. The Roman Empire is at its peak, stretching from Britain to Baghdad, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Emperor Septimius Severus rules with an iron fist, and he's just issued an edict that will change everything. No new conversions to Christianity or Judaism. Period. Anyone caught defying this order will face the arena. Death by spectacle. This isn't just about religion. This is about control. Christianity is spreading like wildfire through the Roman world, and it's terrifying the establishment. These Christians don't worship the emperor. They don't sacrifice to the Roman gods. They talk about a kingdom that isn't Rome, a king who isn't Caesar. They're telling slaves they're equal to their masters. Women, they have souls worth saving. Poor people, they matter as much as the rich. To the Roman elite, Christianity isn't just heresy, it's revolution. In this world of marble temples and brutal spectacle, Vibia Perpetua was an anomaly. She was born into wealth, educated in literature and philosophy, married to a man of good standing. She lived in a villa with mosaics and gardens, owned slaves, wore silk imported from China. By every Roman standard, she had everything a woman could want: security, status, a beautiful baby son who gurgled and laughed in her arms. She should have been content to burn incense at the household shrines, to offer wine to the gods of her ancestors, to live quietly within the gilded cage of Roman womanhood. But Perpetua had heard something that changed everything. The story of a Jewish preacher who said the last would be first, who touched lepers and dined with prostitutes, who promised that death wasn't the end. She had listened to Christians speak of a love that didn't depend on wealth or status, of a hope that couldn't be crushed by empires, of a life that continued beyond the grave. And despite having every reason to stay silent, despite having everything to lose, Perpetua chose to believe. When Severus's edict came down in early 203, Perpetua could have hidden. She could have played along, offered the required sacrifices, and practiced her faith in secret like thousands of other Christians across the empire. No one would have blamed her. She was a new mother, barely out of her teens, with a whole life ahead of her. But Perpetua made a choice that defied every rational calculation. She continued attending Christian gatherings openly. She continued studying the scriptures with her catechist, Satyrus. She continued preparing for baptism, the ritual that would formally mark her as a follower of Christ. It was a death sentence, and she knew it. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning. Roman soldiers pounded on the villa door before dawn, their armor clanking in the courtyard, their faces grim with official duty. They had names: Perpetua, Felicitas, her slave who had also converted, Revocatus, another slave, Saturninus and Secundulus, young men barely out of boyhood, and Satyrus, their teacher, who had voluntarily joined them rather than let his students face death alone. They were dragged from their homes in chains, paraded through the streets like common criminals while crowds gathered to stare. Some shouted curses, others wept. Children threw stones while their parents held them back or urged them on. These weren't hardened revolutionaries or dangerous terrorists. They were ordinary people whose only crime was believing in something Rome couldn't control. The trial was a formality, a theater of imperial justice designed to crush rebellion through fear. Procurator Hilarianus presided, a man whose career depended on maintaining order in this restless province. He had dealt with Christian troublemakers before. Usually, a few threats were enough. Show them the instruments of torture, describe the horrors of the arena, remind them of what they'd be leaving behind. Most recanted. Most chose life. But as Perpetua stood before him, her baby crying in her arms because they wouldn't let her leave him behind, something in her eyes told Hilarianus this wouldn't be easy. The questioning began gently. "Are you Vibia Perpetua, wife of name, mother of son's name, citizen of Carthage?" She nodded. "Do you know why you're here?" She knew. "I am a Christian." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Hilarianus tried reason first. She was young, barely 18. She had a baby who needed his mother. Her family was respectable, influential. Surely she understood the consequences of her stubbornness. Surely she could see that a simple sacrifice, a pinch of incense on the altar, would solve everything. No one expected her to stop believing privately. The empire was vast and tolerant. Just show proper respect to the gods who had made Rome great. Just acknowledge Caesar's authority. Just conform. Perpetua listened politely. Then she picked up a water jug from the floor of the courtroom. "Do you see this jug?" she asked. "Can it be called by any name other than what it is?" Hilarianus frowned. "No. Neither can I call myself anything other than what I am. I am a Christian." It was a simple analogy, but it cut through every argument the empire could make. She wasn't playing word games or theological chess. She was stating an identity so fundamental that denying it would be like denying her own existence. The trial was over. Hilarianus had no choice. The law was clear. The sentence was death. But the Roman legal system offered one final mercy, if you could call it that. Perpetua was nursing a baby, and Roman law prohibited executing pregnant or nursing mothers. She would be held in prison until her son was weaned, then thrown to the beasts in the arena. It was meant to be a kindness, a chance for her to reconsider. Instead, it became the cruelest torture imaginable. Months of waiting, knowing exactly when and how she would die, watching her baby grow while counting down the days until she would have to leave him forever. The prison was a nightmare. A stone cell barely larger than a closet, shared with the other condemned Christians and whatever criminals happened to be awaiting execution. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, vomit, and fear. There was no window, no light except what filtered down from a grate high above. The floor was dirt and straw that had long since rotted into mud. Prisoners were given just enough food to keep them alive until their execution dates. Water was rationed. Privacy didn't exist. And in this hell, Perpetua tried to care for her infant son. Nursing a baby in prison was agony. Perpetua was malnourished, stressed, terrified. Her milk was thin and inadequate. The baby cried constantly, a sound that echoed off the stone walls until it drove everyone mad. Other prisoners cursed her for the noise. Guards mocked her maternal struggles. Even some of her fellow Christians questioned whether her stubbornness was worth her child's suffering. Why not recant? Why not save herself and her son? What kind of mother chose martyrdom over motherhood? But Perpetua had visions. In the darkness of her cell, as her baby sobbed against her chest, she saw glimpses of something beyond the stone walls and iron bars. She dreamed of a ladder reaching to heaven, lined with swords and spears that would tear apart anyone who climbed carelessly. She saw herself ascending, stepping on the head of a serpent, reaching a garden where a shepherd waited with milk and honey. She dreamed of her brother Dinocrates, who had died young, suffering in a place of darkness until her prayers brought him light and relief. These visions weren't hallucinations born of hunger and despair. To Perpetua, they were promises, glimpses of the reality that lay beyond death, the hope that made her sacrifice meaningful. As the months passed, the pressure intensified. Her father visited repeatedly, each time more desperate than the last. He was a prominent citizen who had worked his entire life to build the family's reputation. Now, his daughter's stubbornness was destroying everything. He begged, pleaded, threatened, wept. He brought her baby to her cell, holding the crying infant up so she could see what she was abandoning. "Have pity on your father's gray hairs," he cried. "Have pity on your infant son who cannot live without you. Give up your pride and don't destroy us all." It was the kind of emotional manipulation that would break most people. A father's love weaponized, a baby's need used as a tool of coercion. But Perpetua remained unmoved. Not because she didn't love them, but because she believed in something bigger than family, something that transcended even the bonds of blood. The most heartbreaking moment came when prison officials finally decided the baby was old enough to be weaned. Roman law was specific. Nursing mothers couldn't be executed. But once the child no longer needed milk, the protection ended. When they came to take her son away, Perpetua experienced something that nearly broke her resolve. The baby reached for her as the guards carried him off, his small hands grasping at air, his cries echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. She would never see him again. Never watch him take his first steps, never hear him say her name, never comfort his nightmares or celebrate his victories. He would grow up without a mother because she had chosen a dead carpenter over her living child. But here's what's remarkable about the historical record. Perpetua didn't break. In the account she left behind, written in her own hand on whatever scraps of parchment she could find in prison, she describes the moment of separation with devastating honesty. "I was tortured by anxiety for my baby because he was not accustomed to being away from me. But by God's grace, the child no longer wanted to nurse, and my breasts no longer troubled me. So I was relieved of both the anxiety about my child and the discomfort of my body. It reads like emotional numbness, the kind of protective dissociation that trauma victims develop to survive unbearable loss. But Perpetua frames it as divine intervention, God easing her path to martyrdom by removing the natural attachments that would make death impossible. The games were scheduled for March 7th, 203 CE, the birthday of Caesar's son, Geta. It was meant to be a celebration, a festival of imperial power and Roman dominance. The amphitheater would be packed with 20,000 spectators who had come to watch criminals and wild animals provide entertainment through mutual destruction. Perpetua and her companions weren't the main event, just the opening act before gladiator fights and more elaborate executions. But their case had attracted attention throughout Carthage. A young noblewoman choosing death over apostasy was unusual enough to draw crowds. The night before the games, something extraordinary happened. Perpetua had another vision, but this one was different. She saw herself in the arena, but instead of facing wild beasts, she was confronting a terrible Egyptian gladiator. As they fought, she felt herself transforming, becoming a man, growing stronger and more powerful. She defeated the gladiator and was crowned with victory. When she woke, she understood the symbolism. Her real battle wasn't with lions or bears. It was with the devil himself, and she would win. March 7th dawned clear and cold. In their cell, the condemned Christians shared a final meal, what they called an agape, a love feast. They prayed together, sang hymns, and prepared to meet their God. Perpetua asked for a stylus and wrote her final entry. As for what happens at the games themselves, let whoever wishes write it down. She was 22 years old. Her handwriting was steady. The procession to the arena was meant to humiliate. The condemned were forced to wear costumes mocking their beliefs. The men were dressed as priests of Saturn, the women as priestesses of Ceres. It was psychological torture, forcing them to participate in the very paganism they had died to reject. But Perpetua refused to cooperate. When guards tried to force the costume on her, she fought back with a fury that surprised everyone. "We came here voluntarily," she declared, "so that our liberty might not be destroyed. We agreed to give up our lives so that we would not have to do anything against our religion. This was our agreement with you." The guards, perhaps recognizing the futility of forcing a woman about to die to wear a dress, relented. In the arena, 20,000 Romans watched as the condemned Christians were brought before the wild animals. The crowd was there for entertainment, but what they witnessed was something else entirely. These people weren't screaming in terror or begging for mercy. They were calm, almost serene. They sang hymns as the animals were released. They embraced each other as death approached. They faced their executioners with a composure that unsettled even hardened spectators. For Perpetua and Felicitas, the Romans had prepared a special torment. A mad heifer chosen, specifically to mock their gender. The beast charged, goring and trampling them while the crowd cheered. But both women survived the initial attack, bloodied and broken, but still conscious. Roman law required that condemned prisoners be killed by sword if the animals failed to finish the job. But the executioner assigned to Perpetua was young and nervous. His first thrust missed, hitting bone and cartilage but failing to find a vital organ. Perpetua screamed, then did something that shocked everyone in the arena. She grabbed the soldier's trembling hand and guided his sword to her own throat. Even in death, she maintained control. The crowd fell silent. This wasn't what they had come to see. This wasn't the screaming terror and desperate pleas that made executions entertaining. This was something else, something that made comfortable Romans deeply uncomfortable. These Christians had died like they had lived on their own terms, according to their own values, in defiance of everything Rome stood for. And in that defiance, something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Within hours, copies of Perpetua's prison diary were circulating through the Christian underground. Her account of visions, prayers, and unwavering faith became one of the most powerful pieces of early Christian literature. Unlike the Gospels, which were written decades after Christ's death by people who may never have met him, Perpetua's diary was immediate, personal, visceral. Here was a real woman facing real death for real faith, and her words carried the authenticity of lived experience. But the impact went beyond literature. Perpetua's martyrdom became a template for Christian resistance, a proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary holiness through suffering. Her willingness to abandon her child for Christ was held up as the ultimate example of proper priorities, the kind of radical devotion that separated true believers from mere cultural Christians. For centuries, Church Fathers would cite Perpetua's example to urge believers toward greater sacrifice, greater commitment, greater willingness to lose everything for their faith. Yet, there's a disturbing undertone to how Perpetua's story was remembered and retold. Early Christian writers were fascinated by her martyrdom, but uncomfortable with her authority. In official accounts written by male church leaders, Perpetua's agency was minimized, her visions attributed to divine intervention rather than personal revelation, her defiance framed as holy submission rather than individual choice. They couldn't ignore her because her story was too powerful, too well documented, too inspiring to the faithful. But they could reinterpret her, molding her memory to fit their theological agenda. The real Perpetua was more complex than the saint the church created. She was a young woman who made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances, who chose abstract faith over concrete love, who abandoned her baby for a God she had never seen. Modern readers might find her decision incomprehensible, even cruel. How could any mother prioritize religious conviction over her child's welfare? How could any rational person choose torture and death over a simple ritual sacrifice that meant nothing to anyone? But Perpetua lived in a world where identity was everything, and compromise was spiritual death. To her, denying Christ wasn't just telling a lie or performing an empty ritual. It was annihilating herself, becoming someone she couldn't live with. In her mind, she wasn't abandoning her son. She was showing him that some things mattered more than survival, that integrity was worth any price, that there were principles so fundamental that dying for them was better than living without them. The historical impact of her choice rippled through centuries. Perpetua's diary became required reading in early Christian communities, her feast day a major celebration in the North African Church, her name invoked whenever believers faced persecution. During the Protestant Reformation, reformers cited her example to justify breaking with Rome. During the French Revolution, Catholic priests facing execution found strength in her story. During the Holocaust, Christian resistance fighters drew inspiration from her willingness to die rather than compromise. But perhaps the most significant legacy is one the Church Fathers never intended. Perpetua's diary is one of the earliest pieces of Christian literature written by a woman, and it preserves a female voice speaking with authority about the most fundamental questions of faith and sacrifice. In a religion that would spend centuries silencing women, Perpetua's words survived because they were too powerful to suppress. She became, almost by accident, a patron saint of female religious authority, proof that women could receive visions, make theological arguments, and speak with divine authority. The arena where Perpetua died is gone now, buried under the modern city of Tunis. But her words remain, preserved in manuscripts scattered across European libraries, translated into dozens of languages, studied by scholars who try to understand the psychology of martyrdom and the sociology of early Christianity. And in those words we glimpse something that transcends religious doctrine or historical analysis. We see a young woman facing the ultimate test of her convictions, choosing principles over comfort, eternity over time, faith over family. Whether we find her choice admirable or horrifying depends on our own values, our own understanding of what makes life worth living. But we cannot deny its authenticity. Perpetua believed so completely in the reality of her faith that she was willing to stake everything on it. In an age of casual commitment and comfortable compromise, her story challenges us to consider what, if anything, we would be willing to die for. The priest who offered her that final poisoned chalice, who gave her the choice between apostasy and death, probably went home thinking he had done his duty to Rome. He couldn't have known that he was participating in the creation of a legend, that the young woman who chose death over denial would outlive the empire that killed her. 22 years old, barely out of childhood herself, abandoning her own child for a carpenter's promise of eternal life. It was madness. It was faith. It was the kind of uncompromising conviction that built Christianity and changed the world. The baby she left behind probably grew up hearing whispered stories about his mother, the woman who chose God over family, principle over pragmatism, death over compromise. Did he understand her choice? Did he forgive it? Did he follow her faith or reject it? History doesn't tell us. But every time someone chooses conscience over convenience, principle over profit, truth over safety, they echo Perpetua's decision in that Carthaginian prison. She was 22 years old when they led her into that arena. She had been a mother for barely a year. She had seen the worst humanity could offer, and the best faith could inspire. And when the moment came to choose between her life and her beliefs, she didn't hesitate. The sword found its mark. The crowd fell silent. The empire continued. But something had changed. In the heart of Roman Africa, in the space between earth and heaven, a young woman had proven that there are some things more powerful than fear, more lasting than empires, more important than life itself. Perpetua's story is still being written. Every time someone stands up to power, speaks the truth to authority, chooses principles over popularity, they continue her legacy. She died believing that her sacrifice would matter, that her faith would outlive her persecutors, that her God would vindicate her choice. 2,000 years later, we remember her name, while the emperors who killed her are footnotes in history books. She was right. The truth she died for proved stronger than the empire that tried to silence it. The love she chose proved more lasting than the family she left behind. The faith she embraced proved more powerful than the fear that should have broken her. In the end, that may be the most remarkable thing about Perpetua's story. Not that she died for her beliefs, but that her death accomplished exactly what she hoped it would. It inspired others to similar courage, strengthened the faith community she loved, and preserved a testimony that has challenged and comforted believers for 20 centuries. She gambled everything on the reality of resurrection, the truth of eternal life, the promise that death is not the end. And her words, surviving across the centuries, suggest that she may have been right. 22 years old, a mother, a martyr, a voice that refused to be silenced. Vibia Perpetua died as she lived, on her own terms, according to her own understanding of what mattered most. And in a world that often demands compromise, comfort, and conformity, her story remains a reminder that some convictions are worth any price. Some truths are worth any sacrifice. Some hopes are worth betting everything on, even life itself. But there's more to this story, more layers of horror and heroism that history has tried to sanitize. Because Perpetua wasn't alone in that arena. Standing beside her, bleeding from the same wounds, dying the same death, was another young woman whose story is even more devastating. Her name was Felicitas, and she was Perpetua's slave. She was also 8 months pregnant when they arrested her. Think about that for a moment. While Perpetua was nursing a baby she would soon lose, Felicitas was carrying a child she would never meet. 2 mothers, 2 impossible choices. 2 women whose bodies became battlegrounds in a war between empire and faith. The Roman legal code was clear about pregnant women. Like nursing mothers, they couldn't be executed until after giving birth. But unlike Perpetua, whose trial was delayed by months, Felicitas faced a different kind of torture. She was scheduled to die with her companions on March the 7th, but her baby wasn't due until March. Roman law would force her to wait alone, to watch her friends die while she lived on for a few more weeks, carrying a child in a prison cell, giving birth in chains, only to face the arena anyway once her baby was old enough to survive without her. The night before the scheduled execution, as Perpetua wrote her final diary entry and the men prepared their souls for death, Felicitas began to labor. 8 months pregnant, malnourished, terrified, her body decided it couldn't wait any longer. The labor was agony. In that stone cell with no midwife, no clean water, no soft bedding, Felicitas screamed as her child fought to enter a world that had already condemned them both. The guards mocked her pain. "You're suffering now," they jeered. "But what will you do when you're thrown to the beasts?" Her response has been preserved in the martyrology records. "Now I suffer what I suffer, but then another will be in me who will suffer for me, because I am about to suffer for him." It was a theological statement wrapped in the agony of childbirth. Felicitas believed that Christ himself would inhabit her body in the arena, that her suffering would become his suffering, that her death would participate in his death and resurrection. But it was also the cry of a woman who knew she was about to lose everything. The baby, when it finally came, was premature, fragile, covered in blood and prison filth. A girl, born into slavery, destined for orphanhood before she had even opened her eyes. Here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. Roman law required that the baby be handed over to Felicitas's owner, Perpetua's family. This newborn girl, whose mother would die tomorrow, became the property of the very people who had failed to save her mother's life. The infant was carried away while Felicitas was still bleeding from the birth, still weak from labor, still processing the reality that she had brought a child into the world only to abandon her immediately. And then, barely able to walk, she was led to the arena to die alongside her mistress. The relationship between Perpetua and Felicitas adds another layer of complexity to this already devastating story. In Roman society, the gap between mistress and slave was supposed to be absolute. Slaves were property, tools with souls, beings who existed solely to serve their owner's needs. But Christianity preached radical equality. In Christ, Paul had written, there was neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. All were one in the body of believers. So when Perpetua converted to Christianity, she didn't just change her own life, she changed her relationship with everyone around her, including the young woman who had been bought and sold like livestock. But did she really see Felicitas as an equal? The historical record is frustratingly silent on the dynamics between these two women. Perpetua's diary mentions Felicitas only briefly, noting her pregnancy and her labor, but revealing little about their personal relationship. Did they pray together in that cell? Did they comfort each other through the long nights of waiting? Did Perpetua use her privilege to protect her slave? Or did the power dynamics of Roman society persist even in the face of shared martyrdom? We don't know, and perhaps that silence is itself revealing. What we do know is that these two women, separated by everything Roman society considered important, died together. Master and slave, free woman and property, they shared the same faith, the same fate, the same arena. And in their shared death, they challenged every assumption about hierarchy, worth, and human value that the empire was built on. The crowd that watched them die saw something that shouldn't have been possible. A noble woman and her slave facing death as equals, united by something stronger than social status, more powerful than economic position. The aftermath of their deaths reveals another uncomfortable truth about early Christianity. While the church celebrated both women as martyrs, their stories were remembered differently. Perpetua became a saint. Her feast day celebrated across the Christian world. Her diary preserved and copied and studied. Felicitas was honored too, but always as Perpetua's companion, never as a figure in her own right. Even in martyrdom, even in sainthood, the hierarchy persisted. The free woman got top billing. The slave got mentioned in passing. This pattern would repeat throughout Christian history. The church would preach equality in Christ while maintaining the social structures that made equality impossible. Slaves could be saints, but their masters would be greater saints. Women could prophesy, but men would interpret their prophecies. The poor could inherit the kingdom of heaven, but the rich would run the earthly church. Perpetua and Felicitas died believing they were equal in God's eyes, but the institution that honored their memory preserved the very inequalities their faith was supposed to overcome. And what about those babies? The children these women abandoned for their principles. Perpetua's son would have grown up in a prominent family, educated, wealthy, with every advantage Roman society could provide, but also marked forever as the child whose mother chose death over family, whose needs weren't enough to keep her alive. Did he become a Christian, following his mother's faith? Did he reject it entirely, blaming Christianity for his abandonment? Did he spend his life trying to understand why his mother's God mattered more than her child? Felicitas's daughter faced a different fate. Born into slavery, orphaned immediately, she would have been raised by the same family that allowed her mother to die. Think about the psychological complexity of that situation. This child would grow up serving the relatives of the woman who died alongside her mother, living in the household that could have prevented both deaths with a simple word of recantation. Would anyone tell her the truth about her mother? Would she grow up knowing she was the daughter of a martyr? Or would she be told her mother was a criminal who got what she deserved? The more you examine this story, the more disturbing it becomes. These weren't just two women choosing death over compromise. They were mothers abandoning their children for abstract principles, owners and slaves dying together while maintaining the power structures that defined their relationship. Human beings making decisions that sacrificed everything human about their lives for the promise of something beyond humanity. It's beautiful and terrible, inspiring and horrifying, all at the same time. But perhaps that's what makes their story so enduringly powerful. It doesn't fit into neat categories of heroism or villainy, progress or barbarism. Instead, it reveals the true complexity of human conviction, the real cost of uncompromising belief, the way principles and love can conflict in ways that tear the heart apart. Perpetua and Felicitas faced a choice no one should have to make, and they made it according to their deepest understanding of what mattered most. We can admire their courage while questioning their priorities, honor their memory while acknowledging the damage their choices caused. The Roman Empire thought it could solve the Christian problem through spectacle and terror. Kill enough believers publicly, make the cost of faith high enough, and rational people would choose survival over principle. What they discovered instead was that true believers weren't rational in any sense the empire could understand. They operated according to a different logic, valued different things, feared different consequences, and that made them more dangerous than any military enemy, more subversive than any political rebellion. Because here's what the Romans never understood. Perpetua and Felicitas weren't dying for a doctrine or a theology or a religious institution. They were dying for a relationship, a personal connection to a God they believed loved them more than Rome feared them, valued them more than society honored them, knew them more than their families understood them. You can't defeat that kind of conviction with swords or wild animals. You can only hope to outlast it, to wait for the passion to burn itself out, for the believers to grow tired of dying. But Christianity didn't burn out, it spread. And every time someone read Perpetua's diary, every time someone heard the story of two women who chose death over denial, the flame passed to another heart, another mind, another soul willing to risk everything for the promise of something better. The empire tried to snuff out the light by killing those who carried it, but instead they scattered the sparks across the known world, starting fires they could never hope to contain. Today, almost 2,000 years later, we still struggle with the questions their deaths raise. What principles, if any, are worth dying for? When does commitment become fanaticism? How do we balance loyalty to abstract ideals with responsibility to concrete people who depend on us? What do we owe our children, our families, our communities, versus what we owe our consciences, our beliefs, our understanding of ultimate truth? These aren't theoretical questions for most of the world. Right now, today, people are facing versions of the same choice Perpetua and Felicitas faced. Political dissidents deciding whether to speak out against oppressive governments, knowing their families will pay the price. Journalists choosing whether to publish dangerous truths that could cost them their lives. Activists risking imprisonment or death to defend human rights, environmental protection, or social justice. Parents in war zones deciding whether to flee their homes or stay and fight for their children's future. And in many cases, the choice is still the same. Conform or die, compromise or suffer, submit or sacrifice everything you hold dear. The methods have changed. The weapons are different. But the fundamental conflict between individual conscience and institutional power remains as sharp as it was in that Carthaginian arena 20 centuries ago. Perpetua and Felicitas made their choice. They chose the eternal over the temporal, the spiritual over the physical, the abstract over the concrete. They chose God over family, principle over pragmatism, faith over survival. Whether we admire or condemn that choice probably says more about us than about them. But we cannot deny its authenticity, its courage, or its consequences. They died believing their sacrifice would matter, that their example would inspire others, that their God would vindicate their choice and welcome them into an eternal kingdom where pain and separation and imperial power would hold no sway. 2,000 years later, their names are still remembered while their executioners are forgotten. Their faith outlived the empire that tried to destroy it. Their story continues to challenge and comfort people facing impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Were they right? Did their deaths accomplish what they hoped? Did their children forgive them? Did their God welcome them? These are questions that touch the deepest mysteries of human existence, the ultimate meaning of sacrifice, love, and faith. We cannot answer them with certainty, but we can honor the courage it took to stake everything on the answers they believed were true. 22 and 18 years old. 2 mothers, 2 martyrs. 2 women who refused to let an empire define their worth, dictate their beliefs, or determine their destiny. They faced the ultimate test of their convictions and passed it, paying a price so high that even their admirers sometimes question whether the cost was worth it. But they believed it was. And in the end, perhaps that belief, that absolute commitment to something greater than themselves, is the most human thing about their story. Because that's what humans do. We believe in things we cannot prove, hope for things we cannot see, sacrifice for things we cannot fully understand. We create meaning in the face of mortality, find purpose in the midst of suffering, discover love that transcends death itself. Perpetua and Felicitas embodied these essentially human qualities in their most extreme form. They bet everything on the conviction that there was more to existence than what Rome could offer or threaten, more to life than what could be preserved through compromise and conformity. They were 22 and 18 years old. They should have lived long, full lives, watched their children grow, found ways to practice their faith quietly and safely. Instead, they chose to die publicly and dramatically, leaving behind a story that has inspired and troubled countless others across 20 centuries. Their choice echoes still, in every conscience that refuses to be silenced, every principle that will not be compromised, every hope that dares to believe in something better than the world as it is. The arena is gone. The empire is dust. The babies they left behind lived and died centuries ago. But the questions their deaths raised about love and loyalty, sacrifice and meaning, faith and family. Continue to challenge anyone willing to examine their own deepest convictions. What would you die for? What would you live for? What would you abandon, and what would you preserve? What do you believe so completely that you would stake your life on it? Perpetua and Felicitas answered those questions with their blood. Their answer echoes still in every heart brave enough to choose truth over safety, conscience over convenience, eternal hope over temporal comfort. They were mothers who abandoned their children for their God. They were women who chose death over denial. They were human beings who believed so completely in something beyond themselves that they were willing to lose everything human about their lives to gain something they believed was infinitely more valuable. Right or wrong, wise or foolish, admirable or appalling, their choice was authentic. And authenticity, the courage to live and die according to your deepest convictions regardless of the cost, may be the rarest and most precious thing in any age. Perpetua and Felicitas possessed it absolutely. It cost them everything. And 2,000 years later, it still lights the way for anyone brave enough to follow where conscience leads. Whatever the price, whatever the pain, whatever the world might say about the choice. But there's one more layer to this story that makes it even more disturbing, even more relevant to our modern world. Because what happened in that Carthaginian arena wasn't just about religion or politics or the clash between empire and faith. It was about something far more fundamental and far more dangerous to those in power. It was about the radical idea that individual conscience could trump institutional authority, that personal conviction could override social obligation, that ordinary people could claim the right to decide for themselves what was true, what was valuable, what was worth living and dying for. The Roman Empire wasn't just killing Christians, it was trying to kill the very concept of individual moral authority. Rome worked because everyone understood their place in the hierarchy. Citizens obeyed the emperor. Slaves obeyed their masters. Women obeyed their fathers and husbands. Children obeyed their parents. The whole system depended on unquestioning submission to legitimate authority. And Christianity, with its radical message that every soul was precious to God, that every individual had direct access to divine truth, that earthly power was temporary while spiritual authority was eternal, threatened to bring the whole structure crashing down. When Perpetua stood before Procurator Hilarianus and declared, "I am a Christian," she wasn't just confessing her religious beliefs. She was asserting her right to define herself according to her own understanding of truth, rather than accepting the identity Roman society had assigned to her. She was claiming moral autonomy in a world that denied such autonomy to women, to young people, to anyone outside the narrow circle of elite male citizens. And that claim was more dangerous to the empire than any military rebellion. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If a young noblewoman could reject the gods of her ancestors because her conscience told her they were false, what was to stop slaves from rejecting the masters? Their society told them they must obey. If a mother could prioritize her religious convictions over her maternal duties, what was to stop citizens from prioritizing their personal beliefs over their civic obligations? If individual conscience could override family loyalty, social expectations, and imperial law, then the entire basis of Roman authority was called into question. The Romans understood this threat intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern terms. They knew that Perpetua and her companions weren't just refusing to sacrifice to pagan gods. They were modeling a new way of being human, one that located ultimate authority in individual conscience rather than external institutions. And that model was spreading. Across the empire, ordinary people were choosing personal conviction over social conformity, eternal truth over temporal power, spiritual freedom over physical safety. The arena was Rome's answer to this threat. Public execution wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. It was a dramatic demonstration of what happened when individual conscience challenged imperial authority. The message was clear. Step out of line, assert your right to think for yourself, and this is what you get. Death by spectacle, your body torn apart for the entertainment of crowds who had learned to stay in their assigned places. But the Romans made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that the sight of martyrdom would terrify potential converts, that the spectacle of death would convince rational people to choose survival over principle. Instead, they created something far more powerful than fear. They created witnesses. Every person who watched Perpetua and Felicitas die with dignity, who saw them face their executioners with calm courage, who heard them sing hymns as the wild animals were released, witnessed something that challenged everything they had been taught about power, authority, and human worth. The crowd that day in Carthage came expecting entertainment and left having seen transformation. They watched too. Young women die not as victims but as victors, not as criminals but as heroes, not as enemies of the state but as examples of something higher than the state. And that image, burned into the memory of 20,000 spectators, spread through the empire like wildfire. Word of mouth carried the story faster than any official proclamation, and each telling added another layer of meaning, another challenge to the assumption that Rome's power was absolute. The historical records show that persecution often had the opposite of its intended effect. The blood of martyrs really did become the seat of the church, not because Christians were masochistic or because suffering was inherently valuable, but because public martyrdom demonstrated that there were things more powerful than imperial authority, values more compelling than Roman law, hopes more lasting than earthly empire. Every execution that was meant to crush the Christian movement actually strengthened it by providing irrefutable evidence that these believers possessed something that Rome, for all its wealth and power and military might, could not touch. And this is where Perpetua's story becomes uncomfortably relevant to our own time. Because we live in an age when individual conscience is once again being challenged by institutional authority, when personal conviction is being dismissed as dangerous extremism, when the right to think for yourself is being treated as a threat to social order. The methods are different, the weapons are more sophisticated, but the fundamental conflict remains the same. Today's equivalents of the Roman arena are subtler, but no less effective. Social media mob attacks that destroy reputations and livelihoods. Economic pressure that forces people to choose between their principles and their paychecks. Professional blacklisting that punishes those who step out of line. Political persecution disguised as law enforcement. The message is the same as it was 2,000 years ago. Conform or suffer the consequences. But Perpetua's example suggests that there's something in the human spirit that refuses to be completely tamed, completely controlled, completely broken by external pressure. There's a spark of autonomy, of dignity, of moral authority that no institution can fully extinguish. And when that spark is fanned into flame by genuine conviction, it becomes something that can change the world. The early Christians didn't overthrow Rome through military conquest or political revolution. They simply refused to accept Rome's definition of reality, Rome's assignment of value, Rome's claim to ultimate authority. They insisted, often at the cost of their lives, that there were truths more fundamental than imperial law, loyalties more important than civic duty, hopes more substantial than earthly power. And eventually, impossibly, incredibly, their refusal to submit transformed the empire that had tried to destroy them. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, just over a century after Perpetua's death, the religion she had died for had become the dominant spiritual force in the Roman world. The empire that had fed her to wild animals eventually adopted her faith as its official religion. The gods she had refused to honor were abandoned by the very institutions that had enforced their worship. The authority she had challenged with her conscience eventually bowed to the authority of the God she had served. But this victory came with a price that Perpetua could never have imagined. Once Christianity became the religion of the empire, it began to exhibit many of the same characteristics as the institutions it had once challenged. The church that had been born in defiance of imperial authority became an imperial authority itself. The faith that had championed individual conscience over social conformity began demanding its own forms of conformity. The religion that had elevated martyrs as the highest examples of faithfulness began burning heretics who disagreed with official doctrine. Within a few centuries, the institutional church was doing to theological dissidents exactly what Rome had done to early Christians. The methods were often the same. Public execution designed to terrify potential rebels into submission. The justification was different, protecting orthodox truth rather than maintaining imperial order. But the underlying assumption was identical. Individual conscience must submit to institutional authority. Personal conviction must yield to social control, and those who refuse to conform must be eliminated for the good of the community. This historical irony reveals something disturbing about human nature and institutional power. The oppressed, when they gain power, often become oppressors. The persecuted, when they achieve dominance, often become persecutors. The rebels, when they win their revolution, often establish new forms of the same tyranny they once fought against. Perpetua died to establish the principle that conscience could not be coerced. But the church, built on her sacrifice, spent centuries trying to coerce the consciences of others. And yet her example endures, challenging not just the particular institutions of her time, but the tendency of all institutions to claim absolute authority over individual minds and hearts. Every time someone refuses to submit to unjust power, every time personal conviction trumps social pressure, every time an individual stands up to institutional tyranny regardless of the consequences, they echo Perpetua's choice in that Carthaginian prison. The specific issues change, the particular institutions vary, but the fundamental conflict between individual conscience and collective authority remains constant across history and culture. And Perpetua's story reminds us that this conflict is not merely political or social or economic. It's spiritual, touching the deepest questions about human dignity, moral autonomy, and the source of ultimate authority in human life. What made Perpetua dangerous to Rome wasn't her particular religious beliefs, but her insistence that those beliefs were more important than Roman approval, more authoritative than Roman law, more valuable than Roman rewards or punishments. She claimed the right to evaluate competing truth claims according to her own understanding, rather than accepting whatever the authorities told her was true. And that claim, that fundamental assertion of intellectual and moral independence, was incompatible with any system based on unquestioning submission to external authority. The diary she left behind is remarkable, not just for its religious content, but for its voice of personal authority. Perpetua doesn't write like someone seeking approval or permission. She writes like someone who knows what she has experienced, what she believes, and what she must do. She describes her visions with matter-of-fact confidence. She records her conflicts with family and authorities without apology or self-doubt. She faces death with calm certainty about the meaning and value of her choice. This tone, this assumption of personal authority, was revolutionary in a world that denied such authority to women, slaves, young people, and anyone else outside the narrow circle of elite power. By writing in her own voice, speaking her own truth, and making her own choices regardless of what others expected or demanded, Perpetua modeled a new way of being human that was as threatening to established order as any military rebellion. And that may be the most important lesson of her story for our own time. In an age when institutional authorities increasingly demand not just external compliance, but internal conformity, when dissent is pathologized and nonconformity is criminalized, when the right to think differently is treated as a form of violence, Perpetua's example reminds us that human dignity depends on the preservation of individual conscience, even when that conscience leads to unpopular choices, even when it challenges powerful interests, even when it costs everything we hold dear. The arena where she died is gone. The empire that killed her has crumbled. The particular religious and political issues that defined her conflict have long since been resolved or replaced by new controversies. But the fundamental questions her death raised about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority remain as urgent today as they were 2,000 years ago. Every generation faces the choice Perpetua faced: submit or resist, conform or maintain integrity, accept the authority of external institutions, or trust the authority of internal conviction. The consequences may be different. The methods of pressure may be more subtle. But the essential conflict remains the same, and Perpetua's example continues to illuminate the stakes involved in that conflict. She was 22 years old when she chose death over submission, principle over pragmatism, eternal hope over temporal safety. Her choice echoes still in every conscience that refuses to be silenced, every conviction that will not be compromised, every hope that dares to believe there are truths more important than power, values more lasting than empire, authorities more legitimate than force. The priest who offered her that final choice between apostasy and death could never have imagined that he was participating in a moment that would resonate across 20 centuries, that would inspire countless others to similar courage, that would help establish principles of human dignity and moral autonomy that continue to challenge institutional tyranny in every age. Perpetua died believing that individual conscience could triumph over imperial authority, that personal conviction could outlast political power, that spiritual truth could overcome physical force. 2,000 years later, her faith continues to be vindicated by every person who chooses truth over safety, principle over profit, conscience over convenience. She lit a flame that has never been extinguished, established a precedent that has never been overturned, demonstrated a courage that continues to inspire anyone facing the eternal choice between submission and integrity. 22 years old, a mother, a martyr, a woman who refused to let any institution, no matter how powerful, define her worth, dictate her beliefs, or determine her destiny. She died as she lived, according to her own understanding of truth, faithful to her own deepest convictions, trusting in authorities higher than any earthly power. And in that faithfulness, that trust, that refusal to submit her conscience to external control, she achieved something more lasting than any empire. She demonstrated that human dignity is indestructible, that individual conscience is inviolable, that there are some things no power on earth can touch or defeat or destroy. Her story is still being written in every heart brave enough to value truth over safety, in every mind courageous enough to think independently, in every soul willing to pay any price for the privilege of remaining true to its deepest convictions. Perpetua's choice echoes still, calling each of us to consider what we believe deeply enough to live for, what we value highly enough to die for, what we trust completely enough to stake everything on, even when the whole world tells us we are wrong.